Welcome to the Canyoneering Karma podcast. Your host, Rich Carlson, is here to take you on a journey of learning and exploration. So grab your gear and a rope and follow along.
Hi, thank you for tuning in. The topic of this episode is systematic safety checks. Joining me today is my friend Shannon Long. Shannon is a captain with the Henderson Nevada Fire Department. He's also a guide and instructor with Canyon Guides International. How you doing today, Shannon?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Safety checks is a topic that's near and dear to both of us. You know, canyoneering is a lot of fun, so it's no surprise that there's a social element to it. But there are risks involved in our sport, so it's important that we know when to shift gears and focus on the technical aspects.
Rich, you make an excellent point. There have been many accidents related to not doing a systematic safety check.
Can you think of any specific examples?
Yes, as I said, there have been many, but one that stands out was a climber who was interrupted and got distracted while she was tying in to her belay. Her partner missed the fact that she had not finished tying her knot. The climber was able to complete this climb without falling, and at the top asked her belayer to lower her to the ground, at which point she leaned back, the knot came untied, and she fell, breaking her back. Now, this was not just any person. This was a world-class, maybe one of the best climbers in the world at the time that this happened. She was an expert.
I think I remember that story. If things like that can happen to somebody with that much experience, it can happen to any of us. You know, Shannon, anybody who's taken a course from me in the last few years knows your name because there's a story that I love to tell that involves you. There was a time when a group of people asked me if they could challenge a leader guide exam. And you asked me if it would be okay to put together a station where candidates were required to do a systematic safety check. When I heard your idea, it seemed a little odd to me because I couldn't imagine anybody who wanted to be a leader or guide not being capable of something that is so fundamental to safety. But you insisted, and I let you set up the station. If I remember the station correctly, you had tied a piece of webbing around a tree with a square knot. Then you connected a maillon rapide to that webbing and left the maillon open. You passed the rope through the maillon, rigged a releasable figure-8 block, which was not tied off correctly. And then if you follow the rope down to your harness, your rappelling device was not connected to the ventral tie-in point of your harness. It was connected to one of your leg loops. The other leg loop of your harness was not doubled back to lock the buckle. You were wearing a helmet, but the chin strap was undone. The way you presented it to each person that arrived at your station was you expected them to do a complete system safety check. You told them if they find anything wrong, don't correct it, just bring it to your attention. And you did tell them that there were at least 3 things wrong. Of all of the people who were challenging the exam that day, only one person passed at that station. Is there something that they did different that allowed them to pass where others failed?
Yes. Most of the aspirants, when they came up to the station, after they were given the instructions, they immediately saw one thing that was wrong and they gravitated toward that. Usually it was the rapide. And then they would see something else. And basically were bouncing from one thing that they randomly saw to another. The successful candidate announced that he would do a linear check of the equipment and then proceeded to do exactly that. Basically, he treated it like a chain. And that's what it is. It's like a chain of life. And he systematically started with one end of the chain and worked all the way through each chain link to be sure that they were all secure, because a chain is only as strong as its weakest link.
Do you have a preference whether somebody start their system check from the anchor end or the human end?
Actually, I do. I think it's much better to start with the anchor end of this chain and work toward the repeller.
So the anchor could be a natural anchor like a tree or a boulder or some kind of rock formation, or it could be artificial anchors like bolts.
Of course, the person performing this inspection must be trained and competent.
That's an important point. Next, there's going to be some kind of a connection, whether it be webbing or chain. Anything in particular people should be looking for?
Yes, when it comes to our connections, the things we're looking for are like the knots. Be sure the knots are tied correctly, that they're dressed, and they're set, and they're backed up as needed. If there is a rappel ring or a quick link, inspect it. Carabiners should be inspected visually and physically. When I mean physically, we want an actual press check on the gate to be sure that it is locked.
The next link in the chain is going to be rigging, and you already made the point that whoever does the inspecting needs to be trained and competent so they know what they're looking for.
Yes, Rich, for sure. The training and competence are key. And we're going to follow the rope now down to the rappelling device. And the rappelling device may be something that we're familiar with, and it may be something we're not familiar with. So if you're not familiar with it, how should you handle it? Ask the person. Confirm with them that this is rigged the way they want it for the amount of friction that they want, and then trust them that they understand their device. If it's something you're familiar with, then it's easy. That device then is going to be connected to their harness, to the main attachment point of their harness, with a locking carabiner. You need to visually and physically inspect that carabiner with a press check.
So far, you've made it all the way down the chain to the harness. This part should be easy because everybody wears the exact same harness canyoneering. So if you know your harness well, you'll know everybody's.
If only that were true. The reality is there are several different kinds of harnesses that people use for canyoneering. And the likelihood is that the people in your group are going to have different kinds of harnesses. So how do we manage that? It's going to be similar to the devices. We're just going to need to ask some key questions. One of the key questions is, to understand that is where is the main attachment point for a rappel device, for example? Another key question is, what are the load-bearing buckles? How many are there? And be sure those are the ones that we are going to be inspecting.
So once we determine that their harness is on correctly, is there anything else I should be looking for on the human end of this chain?
Yes, there is, Rich. The next area we want to check is the head. We want to make sure the helmet is on properly, square, and fits appropriately. We want to be sure that the chin strap is buckled. We're also looking for anything that's loose, that might be loose, that could get caught in our device. For example, if you have long hair, that needs to be fastened up and not hanging loose. Also things like hoodie strings or anything else that could get caught in our device.
Thank you for all of that, Shannon. You've done an excellent job of explaining how a good systematic safety check should be done from one end of the life chain to the other. Perhaps we should have given a block of instruction about systematic safety checks before we let that group do the challenge of the assessment. Well, at least through the rest of the assessment, they made sure they were always doing those safety checks, right?
If only that were true. The next day, we had a scenario where the candidate needed to convert a block to a lower. The candidate was given a student/client, and that client was to rappel, tie off, and then the conversion was to be completed. We instructed the candidate that she was in charge of everything from now until the client was on the ground. She instructed the client to rig for rappel and to go on rappel. We had to stop the scenario because there was no systems check performed. We asked her if she performed one, and she said, "Oh, yes, let me do that." And she performed a cursory 5-second inspection that did not seem to be complete at all.
So do you think she was so focused on the task at hand that she let something so fundamental just slip by her?
Undoubtedly, that's what happened.
I suppose it's understandable that a beginner wouldn't be so aware of the importance of doing safety checks, but I don't understand why somebody with experience would let their guard down like that.
Well, Rich, in fact, there are two kinds of people that get hurt doing dangerous things. Those that don't know what they're doing and those that do. So let me explain real quick. People who do dangerous things like scuba diving, like mountaineering, like canyoneering, and if they are responsible for their own safety and they don't know what they're doing, then they're going to get hurt. And they may get other people hurt as well because they simply don't know what they're doing. So that one's pretty easy to understand, right? What about this next group, the second kind of people? These are the people that do know what they're doing. How and why do they get hurt or killed doing these dangerous operations? And the simple answer is they become complacent. They start taking shortcuts. And they simply stop seeing the importance of having a systematic way of checking the equipment. And so this gets into a concept known as normalization of deviance. In our training, we are told, "Thou shalt do a systematic safety check on the equipment every time someone's about to lean over the edge." That's the standard. But what happens is you've got this high standard, but in application after a while, sometimes because of social pressure or time pressure, we start to deviate from that standard. And the first time we deviate from that standard, what happens? Nothing. We did a shortcut on the safety check. We didn't do it very thoroughly, but we sort of did one, and there was no bad outcome. No one got hurt. So now the next time someone's going to lean over the edge and we need to do a safety check. Again, if there's pressure of some sort, we might be tempted to rush through this system check and do it incomplete. What happens? The person rappels down, they don't get hurt, no bad outcomes. So now we're starting to have as a part of our mindset that, well, these system checks are almost kind of optional, or they're not that important. We can, when we're in a hurry or when we're experiencing some sort of social pressure, it's okay if we take some shortcuts in our systems check, because so far we've done this several times and nothing bad has happened. And so then, even when there's no social pressure, there's no time pressure, we've begun this habit of not doing the thorough safety checks. And then this becomes the new normal. So we had this high standard. This is what you shall do according to your training. But now we've got this lower standard that has become what we're doing. And the difference between the original standard and this new standard, that difference becomes invisible. And this new lower standard becomes the standard. Maybe we've stopped doing system checks altogether because it doesn't seem to matter. We're still having good outcomes. People are not getting hurt. And then one day, there's a critical error in the rigging, and it's not caught by a systematic safety check. and the person leans over the edge and falls. This is why it's important to understand the concept of the normalization of deviance. It's a slow, gradual process sometimes, and you don't always notice that it's happening until you've normalized this new standard and somebody gets hurt. And that's what we need to avoid.
So, Shannon, can you recommend a system or a process for a canyoneering team to keep this cycle from starting, or if it does start, how to keep it from cascading?
Yes, let's talk about that. The first thing you need in a recreational group is buy-in. Now, in my role as captain or my role as a range master, senior instructor, I get to dictate how we are going to do things, how we are going to operate. And that's an authoritarian approach, but that approach does not work in a recreational context. In a recreational context, you have to get buy-in, voluntary buy-in to how you're going to operate. So at the fire department, we have 4 items that guide our operations. The first one is a standard, operating at a standard. Secondly, being consistent in applying that standard. And third, coordinating the application of that standard. And that involves the communication. And then the 4th item is accountability, where we're going to hold each other accountable for adhering to our standards. So let's talk about each of those a little bit more. In the fire service, we have standards, and our standards we call standard operating procedures. And these are the things that we've said are going to guide our operations. Secondly, the expectation is that we are going to adhere to those standards consistently. That is to say, we're not just going to apply those standards here and there. Sometimes we're going to do them, or sometimes we're not going to do them. No, the expectation is that we are consistent in adhering to those standards. Third involves coordination. And what this is about is the communication between team members. The 4th one is accountability. And this is where we need to hold each other accountable for the standards.
That sounds like a very effective system, but it's a regimented approach that works well in the military and the fire service. But organizing canyoneers is a lot like herding cats. So I'm imagining this scenario where I just met some new people on a canyoneering Facebook group. We've met at a trailhead, and nobody's viewing me as El Jefe. So do you have any suggestions on how I can convince my group to buy into this kind of a system?
So one thing you can do is to ask the group, who is responsible for safety today? Raise your hand. I should see all hands in the air, and we will not proceed until we have all hands in the air. So now that I have buy-in, we need to then discuss what our standard is going to be with regard to systematic safety checks. And the standard that I will propose is that on every vertical problem, we perform our systems checks.
So you set a standard, you said we will do systematic safety checks, and you emphasize the consistency. You will do them at every vertical drop. So your 3rd item was coordination and communication. There is some standard communication we use at rappels. It starts with on belay, belays on. Then before you lean back over the edge, you yell on rappel or on rope to let people know that you're on the move. Where do I fit my system safety check into that?
First, let me introduce two more terms that we use. The first one is stop. Now, we use stop in more than one way. We use it as a warning that something unsafe is either happening or about to happen, so that we can correct whatever that is and then be able to move forward. It's a word that anyone can use in that context. If you see something unsafe, say something, say stop. We also use it in a non-emergency scenario, and we use it right before we're going to do our systems check. So it sounds like this: on belay, belay on, stop, systems check. Now, systems check is that second word that I want to introduce, and this is just what we say when we're going to do our systematic safety inspection. We just say systems check. So stop, systems check. It's not an emergency. It's just our process. And it does let people know, hey, let's get the chatter down. Stuff's about to get real. Someone's life is about to be on the line. And we need to focus on what's important. We need to focus on our systems check.
I like that process, especially doing it right before somebody goes over the edge. At that point, we expect that the system is complete and we're in a position where we can inspect every component.
The other important thing to remember is that this needs to be a continuous, uninterrupted process. If during your systems check you find a significant problem, the systems check at that point stops, the problem is fixed, and the systems check has to be restarted. Similarly, if you are interrupted during your systems check for any reason, you need to restart the systems check. Oh, and by the way, when you're doing these systems checks, you should do the systems checks as if the person who rigged it is a moron. In other words, you should not have the complacent attitude that probably everything's okay. Your attitude should be, there's most likely something wrong here, and I'm going to find it.
So there's one more item in your process. Number 4 was accountability. And that applies to everybody in the group, even beginners. Don't be shy about insisting that you give systems checks even to the most advanced, competent people in your group. And take Shannon's advice. Approach the systems check as though you're doing it for a moron. You know that even that experienced person did something wrong, and you are going to find it. I'm reminded of a particular incident. An experienced canyoneer had tied a piece of webbing around an anchor, and a beginner looked at it and something just didn't seem right. So the beginner questioned the more experienced canyoneer, who said, "You don't need to be checking my rigging. I know what I'm doing." Unfortunately, the knot had been tied incorrectly, and the first person who weighted it, the knot came untied, and that person fell 30 feet.
Imagine what it must have felt like for that beginner, quote unquote, who was trying to do the right thing, who saw something and he said something and it didn't matter. And he's thinking to himself, I should have said more. I should not have accepted the expert's pronouncement. I knew it was wrong, and I let it happen anyway.
That must have been a tough spot to be in. Shannon, thank you for being a part of this episode. I really appreciate your time and your expertise.
It's been a pleasure.
I hope this episode has inspired our listeners. I hope you're encouraged now to always, always, always do thorough, systematic safety checks.
And remember, there's two kinds of people that get hurt doing this. Don't be either one.
Bonus material for this episode is available in the podcast section of my website. Check it out at canyonsandcrags.com.
Thank you for joining us at the Canyoneering Karma podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, have fun, be safe.